Microcosmic Orbit, Macrocosmic Orbit, and Microcosmic Reflection. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Chi Life. So Microcosmic Orbit, Macrocosmic Orbit, Microcosmic Reflection, these are three terms that you might hear from time to time if you're practicing Qigong, and they sound kind of similar, and they are in fact related to each other. And this sometimes leads to people getting a little bit mixed up between the terms and what they're referring to. So that's what this vlog's going to be about. I'll go through and talk about each of these in turn and hopefully make it nice and clear about what each of them is about and also how they're connected together. I'm going to start by talking about microcosmic reflection because this is the most broad and general of those terms. And then I'll come back to microcosmic orbit and macrocosmic orbit. And then finally I'll come back to microcosmic reflection again because it's a really beautiful principle. Again, a very broad principle that so much of Qigong practice is based around. And I have come to this beautiful location. You can't see everything that is here just yet in this shot, but I've come to this beautiful spot here specifically because there's some things here that I can use to illustrate some little things about microcosmic reflection. There's some great visuals for us here. So, to begin with, what is the principle of microcosmic reflection? Very simply, it's the broad principle that what we see in the universe is reflected at every scale within the universe. So we see the same patterns in galaxies, in solar systems. Coming down into a smaller scale, we see them on a planetary level, we see them within communities, we see them within individual bodies. We then see it down smaller within organ systems, right down to a cellular level, right down to an atomic level. We see the same patterns reflected at all scales through the universe. So micro, small, cosmic, universe, reflection. This idea that the patterns are repeated on a smaller scale. Just within the body, we see these patterns repeated many times within us. Some of you might be familiar with, probably the one that people are most commonly familiar with is reflexology. So often reflexology uses the hands or the feet, the hand or the feet. And the idea is that within the tensions and the patterns that we hold in our hands, it's actually a reflection of what's going on within our whole body. Same with our feet. There's a reflection of what happens within the whole body. And so by working on these areas, we can actually effectively make changes to what's happening right throughout the whole body. This same pattern of reflection occurs through all the tissues of the body, actually. Some of you might have heard of iridology. So this is where you look at the iris of the eye. That's the bit around the pupil with all the color and the fibers in it. And you can find that there are patterns in the iris that reflect what's happening right through the whole body, all of the organs, all of the different parts of the body, and so on. It goes further than that. In Chinese medicine, they often use the tongue. I'm not going to show you my tongue. I'm not going to stick my tongue out at you. They use the face. They use the air. Sometimes even the bones of the body, patterns in what's happening along a single bone, reflects what's happening right through the whole body. And this, of course, is because all the parts of the body are connected, and so those patterns, whatever's happening somewhere in the body, has an effect on the other parts of the body. So we see it just within the body, but we also see it on this larger scale, on a universal level, or down to what we see in nature around us. And this is why, so often within Qigong practice, it's a really effective way for us to learn and gain insight, is to observe things in nature and then see how it's reflected within us. So that's the big principle, microcosmic reflection. I'm going to come back to that one later on, again, talk a lot more about it because it is such a beautiful principle. But for now, what then is the microcosmic orbit? I think for this, I'm going to find somewhere to put this, this camera down so I can step away a little bit so I can show you some things a little bit more easily. So the microcosmic orbit is a specific example of this pattern of microcosmic reflection. It's one specific pattern that we see reflected throughout the universe, and in particular it's the pattern of the cycling from yin to yang and then yang back to yin. And we see this throughout nature. We see it in the cycle of day and night, in the cycle of the seasons, winter to summer, summer back to winter, and so on. It's fundamental to how things work within the universe, that they cycle between yin and yang. Within our body, the strongest reflection of this occurs in an orbit, in a circulation. And if you think about it, that's kind of what creates those patterns that we see in nature as well. It's things moving in circles. The pattern of the seasons, summer to winter, winter to summer, comes because of the way our planet orbits around the sun, and the way this changes which parts of the planet are facing more directly towards the sun, and therefore we get this change in the heat in the different seasons, right? So same within our body, this primary reflection of that pattern of cycling from yin to yang occurs within two of the extraordinary meridians. So this is the governing meridian and the conception meridian, or they're also referred to as vessels. Now, this circulation, so the governing meridian, it comes up the back of the body, and then the conception vessel comes down the front of the body, or vice versa. We can circulate this in either way, up the front, down the back. Either way, you can go in either direction with this particular circulation. This then reflects that cycling from yin to yang, yang to yin. Our head is more yang, more, within, what's going on in our energy. Our pelvis is more yin. And so the energy circulates up from yin up to yang, and then from yang back down to yin, and in a constant circulation, or vice versa, yin up to yang, yang down to yin. And when we activate this circulation and keep it nice and balanced and harmonious, well, it makes our energy nice and balanced and harmonious, and it helps us to have a nice smooth cycling from yin to yang within our energy. So that's the microcosmic orbit. The macrocosmic orbit takes things a little bit further. This then, so again, if we break it down, so microcosmic orbit, that was small, cosmic, universe, orbit. So it's specifically an orbit, a circular movement or circulation. Macrocosmic orbit, large universe circulation. So the key difference here is that now we're referring to the circulation not just within the torso and the head, but out to the extremities of our body. And so this involves some more of the extraordinary meridians, or again sometimes they're known as vessels, where the circulation moves all the way out to the hands, and from the hands to the body, back down to the legs, all the way down to the feet, from the feet back up into the body. So it's that circulation not just within the central part of the body, but larger, macro, out to the extremities. Sometimes when people use this term macrocosmic orbit, they're just referring to the circulation to the extremities and then back in. Other times they're looking at the functioning of all of the extraordinary meridians working together, which includes a little bit more. So in fact, it does include the microcosmic orbit, the central and governing. It does include the circulation out to the extremities, which uses the yin linking and yang linking and the yin heel and yang heel meridians. That's what they're known as. But then it will also include the other extraordinary meridians. So the sash meridian, or sash vessel, which runs around the waist, and then also the thrusting vessel, which comes right up through the center of the body. And together that's like, this is the pattern. This is the big pattern. So we've got the smaller pattern, just the cycling of yin and yang, but then the bigger pattern goes right out to the extremities and involves all of the tissues of the body. So microcosmic orbit, macrocosmic orbit, microcosmic reflection. Hopefully you understand the difference between these now. I'm going to go back to talking about microcosmic reflection a little bit more, because as I mentioned before, it is such a beautiful principle which applies to so much of Qigong practice. Alright, so now you get to see some of the visuals here, some of why I chose this spot to make this vlog, because I've got some nice features of nature here all in one place that I can show you all together, well, over the next couple of shots here. So I have behind me a river. It's a tidal river. That's a hint as to why I suppose chose this particular spot. So yeah, a river behind me. Now, as I mentioned before, some of the aspects of microcosmic reflection, things like reflexology, patterns within the hands, patterns within the eyes, things like that. In fact, all of the patterns we find within our body are actually examples of microcosmic reflection. They're all natural patterns. And so the pattern of the flow of rivers, this is the same pattern that we see within the organ meridians in our body. It's really quite interesting how well the characteristics of our organ meridians, these are the same ones used in acupuncture for putting needles in to stimulate, different activity within the body. It's really remarkable how well the way the organ meridians, their characteristics really mirror the pattern of rivers. The way that sometimes they have a set direction of flow, they're very specifically defined, sometimes they branch and come back together, you know, all these different things. It's like, wow, they really are like rivers. It's pretty cool. We have this pattern of circulation of energy that we see in nature. We see it in ourselves as well. Now, rivers don't just flow, they flow to somewhere. So that's what I'm going to show you next. So of course, as rivers flow, they bring water, moisture, energy, life to the soil, to all of the land around them. But eventually they flow into something. They either flow into a lake or into an ocean. Yeah, pretty cool. This is right at the end of this little river. It's not a very big river, a little stream, as it flows into the ocean. Now, in Chinese terminology, we would refer to this gathering of energy. So the energy after it's flowed through the land, right, it ends up gathering together. And in Chinese terminology, we would refer to this as a dantian. So an ocean of qi, an ocean of energy. Now, of course, once that energy is gathered into the ocean, it doesn't just sit there. It continues to move. Energy needs to move to be healthy. Movement is just part of the process. Now, of course, we can see some waves on the top of the sea at the moment here. But as well as that, there are bigger patterns of motion within the ocean. There are ocean currents that are constantly circulating and turning this water, turning this energy within the ocean. And those are very much like the extraordinary meridians that I talked about earlier in relation to the microcosmic orbit and the macrocosmic orbit. These mirror the patterns of the ocean currents. Now, as those ocean currents circulate, what we find is there is evaporation, and this sends energy up into the atmosphere, up into the sky above. And this is very much like the energy that circulates within our energy fields. And while it's the same in water, the same energy that's circulating in all these different ways, in the river, in the ocean, in the clouds, in the sky above, at each of these different stages, the energy circulates in some different ways. It takes on some different characteristics. In the river, the circulation is very precisely defined. It has a set direction of flow and so on, like I mentioned earlier. In the ocean, with the ocean currents, of course, these are big, wide, powerful currents of energy flow of water, and so that has some different characteristics to it. With the clouds, of course, these are very different again. These are able to drift and move in any direction. Their circulation is much less defined, but yet really, really important. It's part of the whole system, part of the whole cycle, the energy in the energy field, and the way that then feeds back into the system, feeds back into the rivers flow into the oceans and so on. So I think it's pretty cool, the way that we see these patterns through nature, and we can then identify and understand how these patterns operate within ourselves as well. So these particular patterns that I've mentioned, these are the flows of energy that we focus on in the small universe, so microcosmic in a sense, the small universe Qigong program that we run at Long White Cloud Qigong. So we work with practices that focus on each of these different phases of the movement of our energy. So we first focus on activating the energy, simply getting it active and flowing, and that ends with thunder and lightning and gentle rain. So this starts the process off. We then work with the flow of energy in the meridians, in the rivers, and this gives us all sorts of valuable insight about our emotions, our posture, excuse me, and how that affects our organs and so on. From there, we work with practices that focus on the gathering of the energy into the ocean and the circulation within the extraordinary meridians, within the ocean currents, and how this sends energy out to fill our energy fields. And then we work with practices that moves that energy smoothly and freely, like the clouds, through the energy field, completing the cycle. So that's what we focus on in the Small Universe Qigong program. But this principle of microcosmic reflection doesn't just apply to those circulations, it's throughout Qigong practice. We use this principle of looking to nature and drawing insight from it. These are some of the clearest, most standout examples of this pattern of reflection that we find. But even in things like working with the 5 elements, again, we're seeing a pattern reflected in nature where we see, okay, what are the characteristics of wood, of trees? What is the characteristics of water, of fire? How do they interact with each other? And then we learn from that and how we see those things within ourselves as well. So yeah, hopefully this has been helpful. I hope this wind isn't too bad. Hopefully it's not affecting the audio too much. I hope this has been helpful, help you to understand the meaning of those terms: microcosmic orbit, macrocosmic orbit, microcosmic reflection. If you're interested in the small universe Qigong practices, we currently only teach them as a really comprehensive course. It's an instructor's course, but lots of people do it just for their own knowledge and practice as well. I'll put a link to information about that in the description below. Yeah, and I look forward to seeing you on the next vlog, where I'm sure I'll have another interesting topic to talk about then.